We are now more than 2 weeks into this federal election campaign, and the second and final leaders debate is less than an hour away. Efforts are underway to get out the Indigenous vote, and the Assembly of First Nations says First Nations could tip the scales in 36 federal ridings. But Indigenous issues have been absent from the political discourse. We're wondering if that will keep people away from the polls. For more, our Truth in Politics panel is here. Jennifer Lewitz is the CEO of Pasqua Harbor Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Niigaan, we'll start with you. There are voting drives underway to get Indigenous peoples to the polls to vote. There were huge turnouts, especially on reserve in 2015 and 2019, but that dipped in 2021. What do you think we'll see this time around?
Yeah, it dipped in 2021, I think because of what I'll call a wide-scale disappointment with the movement on reconciliation with the federal Liberals. And then if people were disappointed last time, they're definitely going to be disappointed this time because there is almost no talk about Indigenous issues. What happened is from about a 67% turnout back in 2015, 61% in 2015, and then 67% in 2019. Now it's dropped to about 6 or 3 in 5 people come out and vote. You probably will see that less this time around. However, I think when you have Donald Trump influencing an election, all hands are on deck. And it may just be that the fact that Indigenous issues are absent in this election may get swept aside for people who are generally invested in the idea of the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. I think Indigenous peoples are far more interested in engaging, continuing to talk to and be a part of Canada than rather be a part of the United States. And so I think there'll be a decent turnout, but there may be a continued drop this time around.
Jennifer, as Niigaan said there, in the absence of any real discussion on Indigenous issues so far, are you feeling like Indigenous peoples are going to be rushing to the polls in this election?
It's hard to say. I feel like there's definitely been a lack of conversation around Indigenous issues in this election, especially when it's in comparison to the 2015 election when Trudeau made some pretty big promises towards First Nations in this country. The water crisis is a big one. But it has been a little bit concerning just because of the fact that there's some big issues on the table right now. You know, child welfare, we're still having that conversation about that funding, First Nations policing funding, not consultation and consent, especially when you're hearing about resource projects. So there hasn't been a lot of talk, but the sovereignty of Canada is still an Indigenous issue. And Niigaan was absolutely correct. When you have those threats or conversations from down south about annexing Canada and making us the 51st state, that is an Indigenous issue, especially when we are, the original occupiers of this land and we're in a relationship with Canada and the Crown. So it will be interesting to see how many Indigenous people show up to vote, especially when we do have that sway in 36 ridings.
Niigaan, we've talked about the 36 federal ridings where First Nations voters could decide the outcome of the election, but a riding like Kenora Kiiwetinoong, where there are 3 First Nations candidates, currently showing as a 99% lock for the Conservatives, or Thunder Bay Superior North Indigenous Services Canada Minister Patty Hajdu's riding, currently a 99% lock of her winning re-election. Are some of these really swing ridings?
I think when the AFN put out their report, maybe the comms, the communications wasn't always so clear. What that report said is that in 36 ridings, the number of First Nations voters in that riding was larger than the previous spread of vote between the first and second candidate. And so in some ridings, you see very large Indigenous proportions, but for instance, in Winnipeg West, you see actually First Nations voters only make up 3%, but the difference between the first and second place back in 2021 was 1%. So it's a little deceiving to say 36 ridings. I was speaking with Eric Grenier from the RIT, who is widely known as the leading pollster across the country to sort of looks at all the different polls and the ways in which they trend. He has several ridings in Manitoba, Northwestern Ontario, and Saskatchewan, who he calls swing ridings, But for those of us who are in those ridings, we know that those are not really swing ridings. And so there's sort of a bird's eye view of the country as looking at certain ridings. And then there's the actual on the ground kind of ways that happen. So that goes to strength of candidate, that goes to the kind of issues that are being impacted, like, for instance, the tariffs in particular communities, which impact more communities based in industry than others, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole bunch of factors that go into that. What I would say is that it's better to know the locality than it is to be the bird's eye view of what the country's looking like. But the country is absolutely looking towards a Liberal majority, and it's not in any way going to be shaped on any individual riding. But I think certainly there will be a lot of ridings that will be closer than expected.
Right. Jennifer, we've talked about how the NDP could lose party status at one point here. Given this really seems like a two-party race this time around between the Conservatives and the Liberals, do you think that will impact where Indigenous voters cast their ballot this time around?
I definitely think so. I think if some people think that, vote splitting could potentially cost the party that they want to get in their votes, then they're going to do what they can to vote strategically. This does very much feel like a two-party race, especially when the NDP are unfortunately performing terribly. And they're almost the balance in the House that sometimes you need to see, especially when you have a center and then a center-right party that are taking up a majority of the seats. But I think this just highlights why it is so incredibly important for our leaders to be meeting with the two parties that are at the forefront and what their priorities are with Indigenous people across this country. And that would be Prime Minister Mark Carney and Leader of the Opposition, Pierre Poilievre. I don't think that we can ignore those two people right now. I think we need to be at the front and center and having those conversations about where these two leaders fall on various different issues, especially when there's no platforms and we don't know where they fall on all of these different issues. So, yeah, I definitely think it'll be important to hear more from them.
Not costed either. I mean, that's like, when have you seen an election campaign where none of their promises have been costed? That's a real concern.
It's supposed to be coming soon, we're told. Jennifer Kneegan, we'll leave it there for this week. Kneegan, we know you got a busy night tonight. We'll be thinking of you as well. Thanks to you both.
Yeah, me glad. Thanks.